management and distribution. You know, we have in the SWAI states, we have Hawaii, which is a different kind of thing, and in all those airports, or most of those airports are state-owned and operated. But the other three states, and I'm going to use a generic term, aviation divisions, the aviation divisions are embedded into DOT. And in some of those states, DOT, as in California, is embedded into a bigger thing, which is the California State Transportation Agency. And it's umbrella over not only DOT, but the California Transportation Commission, a lot of other things. So there are issues, and the example I would offer, you know, some of the states it might not be much money. Talking to Mike Dickin, it might not be a whole lot of money in Nevada that is being diverted because most of it's already being taken care of. Arizona, the number I'm hearing is $4 to $5 million a year. California, just as a multiplier, current program is about $5.5 million a year. Under the number that the Board of Equalization is using currently, that 5.5 million would be multiplied 25.5 times. So, you know, it brings issues of how you're going to track it, how you're going to manage it, how you're going to spend it. Eligibility and use. Well, we got a California program that's for very specific things, and with that kind of money, things are going to have to change. So all of those things we are just getting into. As I thought about it yesterday during the issues roundtable, this creature has a lot of tentacles, and the more we look, the more those tentacles are touching things. So let's move on. Let me talk about our panelists here. First of all, we have Robin Hunt from the FAA. Robin's bio has already been read a couple of times anyway. But Robin is currently the Deputy Manager of the Airports Division in Los Angeles for the Western Pacific region. Robin was formerly the manager of the San Francisco Airports District Office, position that I vacated about 14 years ago. Enough of that one. So Robin's going to talk about FAA, the background of the policy, and some of the details about how it's going to be administered. We've talked a little bit about management. There's discussion going on in various aviation organizations in California about, well, wait a minute, we've got a certain size program, and if that's multiplied 25.5 times, is there maybe going to be a need for a better way to do that? So Rod Dinger is going to talk a little bit about that. And then rather than try to redesign Caltrans or ADOT or NDOT here this afternoon, we wanted to take a look at how it's being done somewhere else. And we have with us Robert Olislager from Colorado. He's the director of Centennial Airport. He's on the board of aeronautics for the state of Colorado. He has the unique, I think it's unique, history of being both the president of SWAI and the president of the Northwest District. And so did Randy Berg. Okay. And then also, particularly when we get to Q&A, we're going to hold Q&A till the end because I want to make sure we get through the presentations. But also in the audience, we have Gary Cathy, Chief of the Division of Aeronautics for California, and we have Sarah Johnson, who's the Assistant Executive Director of the California Airports Council, who's been very, very involved in this issue. In fact, Sarah and I call each other bookends because she's kind of organizing all the meetings we've been having with the agencies and the legislature, and I've been sort of the liaison with the FAA. So with that, let's begin. Robin, you're up.
Okay, so welcome back. I'm surprised with the whale watching and everything, the otters out there playing. Aviation fuel taxes. All right, I'm not working there. Okay, so just a little background. You just heard. So it got clarified. I think one thing that we don't have on the slide that I'm starting to think more and more needs to be, and that is that although this is FAA policy, and we talk about the policy that came out in 2014 and originally came out in 1999, the one thing is this is actually revenue diversion was actually put into law, and so the use of airport revenues is actually in the legislation, and so the legislation specifically says that any aviation fuel taxes, I'm paraphrasing guys, enacted since 1987 are subject to are considered airport revenues. So, you know, it's not something that FAA's just decided we want to make as our policy. It actually has a history in law. So, but since then, the revenue use policy of 1999, that was when FAA really kind of went in and looked at the whole airport revenue use issue and kind of did the definition of aeronautical versus non-aeronautical. And then more recently, it kind of became clear that maybe people weren't paying that much attention to increases in taxes on aviation fuel. So that's when they implemented the policy of 2014, which went out for comments and then was finalized December 8th. Okay. What taxes on aviation fuel are considered aviation fuel taxes? I mean, it's kind of basically it's any tax on aviation fuel. Sales tax, I mean, it really does, if it's a tax, it's going to be a fuel tax. And subject then to the revenue use policy that all of you are so familiar on, that you can only use airport revenues for the operating cost of the airport system. Okay, so again, when you put in your grants, you always say you're going to, you know, comply. All those certifications we've been talking about. So again, every time you got a grant, everybody's been all along saying they were complying with this. And there it is for the airport capital operating cost, and includes the sales taxes. And they kind of go through this again. Okay, so you guys got it. Any tax, right? Who does it apply to? Well, it doesn't. I think one thing that's unique about this that people have to realize is it doesn't only apply to the airport sponsor. So it's not, if you're an airport authority, it doesn't mean that the city of Monterey can therefore have a sales tax on aviation fuel and they're off the hook. It basically applies to anybody who's collecting it. That's airport revenue, and it has to go back to aviation. So I think, again, that's a little one of the areas that we kind of extend beyond what people are normally used to. I mean, everybody in this room knows that the aviation use policy is kind of an unusual extension of the federal strings into an area that most people aren't used to. And when it comes to the sales tax, you know, the tentacles are even going beyond that. So it's any state, county, municipality. Non-sponsors, so you don't have to be a sponsor to have this apply. Okay, so when they put out the original notice, they got 25 comments from states, airports, industry, nonprofits. Most of them supported the tax. They considered all comments, but then the decision was made to have a 3-year transition period. So the policy was effective December 8th. They put in that December 8th of this year, everybody was supposed to submit their plans if they had a fuel tax, how they would go about returning that to the aviation system. And there was a 3-year transition period given, and the reason for that was Washington basically realized that it was going to take time to unwind some of this, and in a lot of cases, legislation may have to be passed to get that money back to the aviation fund. So they wanted to give everybody the opportunity to actually get that legislation in place. Okay, so again, states had and local governments had to provide their plans. I just heard the other day that even though the plans were due on last month, December, there was, NASAO has asked for kind of some clarification and maybe to provide some examples what a plan would look like. It also requires that if you sponsor or an entity feels that they're grandfathered, that all their taxes were before 1987, then you still have to submit that saying that consider yourself grandfathered, and FAA will review it and ultimately give you a positive thumbs up on that. Okay, so the action plans, those are the ones that were due. They were due to Byron, who it was Randy. Many of you may have known Randy, but Randy has moved to the Northwest Mountain region. So Byron out of the Alaska region is the now acting person. And again, so it was 1987 was the law. So if you had taxes in place before 1987, they can potentially be grandfathered, but you still have to have that in your plan. You still have to say that you consider them grandfathered. There's the transition period again. Okay, so the question always comes down to, well, what if the state or local municipality or county just decides to not reply? Well, as many of you know in this room, FAA takes the airport revenue use policy very seriously. We have put people in non-compliance, and there are penalties actually in the legislation for revenue diversion. The penalty is treble damages. That tends to get people's attention. There's also in the 90s, there was legislation that allowed DOT to stop all transportation grants to an entity that had diverted airport revenue. Another one that tends to get people's attention because the AIP doesn't tend to be, for some communities, their largest DOT money. It's your highway money. It's your, the money for the roads, or if you're in a large metropolitan area, it may be your transit money. So this is kind of goes through again some of the ways that we can take action if someone was to just not reply. I mean, the hope though with all, as they talked about with our new compliance philosophy, I mean, the hope is to work with all of the states and local municipalities, identify the taxes, take the action to get it put into airport revenues, either whether it's to the state or to the airport directly, and to clean it up, not to actually have to take action against anyone. And that really is the hope, and why they're working with all of the associations to try to get the word out and try to help people come into compliance. So a couple of the questions that had come in is, may state general fund monies be used to offset local jurisdictions? And all of these, what will be required for grandfathering, what can it be used for? Again, people in the industry, you guys kind of all know what aviation revenues can be used for. And then the administrative cost of collecting it. And so all of those answers are basically in the docket. A breakdown you guys might want to know of who's actually submitted plans in the Western Pacific region. So one city has submitted a plan. The state has requested an extension as well as one other state. California has had 38, including the state. You guys can see it there. 2 airports, 2 associations, 8 authorities, 19 cities, 6 counties. And Nevada has had the state and 1 county. And as I talked about on Saturday, my slide kind of ran out of room, but Hawaii has also submitted theirs for as well. Here are the actual people that have submitted. So you can look and see if your local municipality or organizations have submitted. California has so many that it goes to 2 pages. And they've got the presentation, so if you want to look up later, everybody can see it. Obviously, everybody has not submitted their plans. I mean, we're fortunate in the Western Pacific region that we had at least all of our states submit a plan or ask for an extension. I think nationwide, they've only had 25 states some of those, they're plans that are saying your grandfather. So we're kind of ahead of the curve in submissions, but I think that as John mentioned at the beginning, we think it's going to be a potentially huge issue for the state of California. And one of the things that I have kind of a follow-up on this is, so California submitted their plan. Their plan does not have a dollar figure as high as John mentioned, and they felt that most of it was probably offset against other services they're providing. So FAA is replying to California as well as any other states where, or municipalities where we don't think that there was sufficient evidence of their support for their statements. So we're replying back, expect the letter to go out in another couple weeks, asking for clarification and support. That's not unique. I mean, in a lot of cases, there's going to have to be follow-up letters. And kind of the problem that we're running into in headquarters, to be honest, is, you know, they were thinking they were dealing primarily with 50 states. Well, now you got all this, not only the states, but you got the municipalities, the local governments. So the number of plans that have to be submitted, reviewed, you know, follow-up questions asked to is a huge undertaking, and they really don't have a lot of staff, so they're having to kind of prioritize those and send them back. So I would encourage you, if your local government has submitted one and they tell you, well, we haven't heard anything, we guess we're okay, that may not be the case, because everybody will get a reply. If you indicate that you're grandfathered, you have to get a letter back from the FAA saying, we agree, you're grandfathered. But in a lot of these, they really don't have enough detail for the decision to be made, so there will be a lot of follow-up letters for support behind the statement. So, again, questions at the end?
Okay, thanks, Robin. So when John asked me to be on the panel, it was really from the perspective of...
Look out! I'm okay.
Did I turn that? Okay, thank you. Oh, that's a great start. Great start. Yeah, live stream. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Kurt. I appreciate that. So from the perspective of California, and I've had the pleasure of working with the California Airports Council. They played a significant role in also coming up with alternatives and working on the SB 747. So I'll talk a little bit. Some of this is redundant with the background. So on November 7th, the FAA adopted amendments to the policy and procedures concerning the use of airport revenues, whereby enforcing long existing requirements that airport-related revenues must remain at the airport, and that the FAA is offering 3 years to get those local governments and states into compliance, and that the state and local taxes on aviation fuel are subject to this rule. So in our case, in California's case, we have both excise and sales tax on aviation fuels. However, the state only remits excise tax to the Caltrans Division of Aeronautics in support of the California Aid to Airports program. The state sales tax on jet fuel has been regularly diverted primarily to the state's general fund and local governments for non-aeronautical use or purposes. So when I'm looking at what could be done, and when we talked as a group for the California Airports Council, what can be done with the windfall, the simple answer is the money goes into the Caltrans Division of Aeronautics Fund. So when I think of that, and that they currently manage a much smaller budget of 5 to 7 million, 5.5, I believe John quoted. Gary, is that accurate? 5.5 million. Okay, and the existing system is not necessarily user-friendly and perhaps need reformed, and that is because there's restrictions and limitations on how the money can be used. And Gary and I have had conversations where, it's for the city of Reading, we've had some frustrations, and I'm sure there's other state airports in that same situation, and we need more flexibility. And would there be issues with them managing an additional, and I put 70 to 200 million, because I've heard numbers all over the place, and I don't know where that final number will come. But so I decided to give a wide berth there. So my suggestion is, of course, collaboration, that we create a task force of stakeholders, and we come up with a plan for the fund dispersion. Let's sit down and let's talk about how the money could best be used for the state of California. We have challenging times and we have challenging issues, and we need to come up with them. So some of the issues, some of the uses I came up with, and also from the different discussions with colleagues and my participation on the California Airports Council, was to assist in airport-related economic development efforts. Not all airports are financially self-sufficient. There may be opportunities out there that the revenue could be used to help achieve that. And there are many. My list of uses are just mine that I've come up with. I'm sure there are many, and we can bring that up at the end of this session. But Intrastate Airline Enhancement Program, that's been close to my heart. Reading, we suffer as a non-hub 139 airport. We've seen a reduction in air service and intrastate, and there are airports across the state that no longer have service, that deserve service, and the state's going to spend $68 billion on the train. And I'm sure that will be good in the long run, but $1 billion could go a long way, for airports. And in this case, these millions of dollars could go. In Reading's case, we could have at one time had seriously have American Airlines would go to Los Angeles if we had a $2 million revenue guarantee in place. So I think that program could come into play and could be helpful. A big one is allow the use for non-AIP grant eligible projects. I think Robin already mentioned it just has to be used for airport operations. It doesn't have to be AIP. I think the certain restrictions through the Caltrans would prohibit that. We could address items like the pilot shortage. As we all know, that's a big issue. Aviation education programs. Tons of deferred maintenance, again, using Reading as a guide. We have many projects in areas that need attention that we just could not come up with the revenue to do. Reading right now is financially self-sufficient, but barely. And then I just put UAS down there because it's such a growing technology and a growing topic and issue. Money could go into there, not just for education, but for different programs as we want to deal with that in a safe way. So in my closing comments, collaboration is needed. I recommend that we try to improve upon the existing bureaucracy of the state aeronautics program, help them reinvent their business practices to make it more user-friendly for all of us. And we need more flexibility to airports. Let's stay away from only AIP-eligible projects, as, of course, the small revenue-challenged airports have a long list of needs. And anybody tell me what that is? I know Scotty knows that answer. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Here to represent actually the state of Colorado. I was recently appointed by the governor to serve on the Aeronautics Board. I want to thank John and the Southwest Chapter for inviting me to speak here. This is by far my favorite conference. I enjoy coming to Monterey. I enjoy seeing so many friends out here. So thank you for having me. I'm not here to talk about why I'm not wearing a Hawaiian shirt or a pair of shorts or flip-flops. I'm not here to talk about Centennial Airport or security or the Denver Broncos. Yo, Steven. This actually started as a joke a couple of days ago. I made a presentation for the Colorado Airports Operators Association, which always does its winter conference as part of the start of our legislative season. So we invite all of our legislators to come out for an evening reception after their opening day. And I just kind of put this slide in there. I'm sorry, this is not the right slide. Why is, there we go. So, so we photoshopped the Broncos logo into our runway. And we did the same thing 2 years ago with when we had a friendly wager with Seattle. And so we actually got the State Aeronautics Board decided to post this on their website, and then it got picked up by somebody on Facebook. And before the end of the day, we had 45,000 likes and retweets and so on and so forth. I call it free advertisement. And it's been quite fun because CBS called us up. They wanted to overfly the airfield so they could take their own pictures. And I said, didn't you realize this was totally Photoshopped? So, we've had a lot of fun with this. Anyway, really proud to represent Colorado. We have 74 public use airports in the state of Colorado with over 7,000 registered aircraft. We support the aviation industry in Colorado, supports 265,000 jobs and in various capacities. And then the total economic impact, which we conduct every 5 years, paid for with Colorado Aeronautics Division funds, an economic impact study, and it's a little under $37 billion. So it's a big industry for Colorado, and it's something that we do not take for granted. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is how we allocate and reallocate our taxes. We have been in compliance since the division was stood up. We were the last state in the country to establish a division, aeronautics division. It was 1988. Our legislative council looked at what the laws were and immediately recognized that they could not divert these funds. And frankly, there was no opposition because they had never collected these funds and diverted them in some sense until the aeronautics division was stood up, and they said, okay, we need to fund this somehow. And so all of the funds generated by sales tax as well as excise tax go directly back into the aviation system and are allocated by the aeronautics division. So first about the revenue tax structure, as you can see here, how that is allocated. I have to say that in 2013 we collected $44 million for the State Aeronautics Division to be redistributed to those 74 airports. That has dropped to $34 million in 2014, and in 2015, and those are unaudited numbers, we're down to about $30 million. A lot of that has to do with the fact that this is based on the price of fuel, not on the gallonage. And all of us have seen what's been happening with the price of fuel. We're anticipating for 2016 and budgeting about $24 million worth of income that will then be redistributed. And I'll talk a little bit about how that happens. But that is a significant drop, and we've had to deal with that. In fact, back in 2013, 2014, we kept issuing funds at about a $44 million level as the fuel rates were slowly decreasing, and we actually overcommitted about $19 million in grants, which is great for the airports. But for the division, it became a bit of an issue, and we have addressed that since then with the governor and are now sort of on an austerity program, if you will, to get back into the business. But the governor, as well as the state, is very committed to its aviation system. So here's another slide on how the funds basically are expended and how they are returned back to the airports. The disbursements, about $20 million goes back to the airports every month. It's reimbursed. Last year was about $20 million. Airports have to spend that on airport operations, on aviation-related functions. About $4.7 million last year went to grant programs, and I will talk a little bit about that here in a second. And then the balance went to operating the division, which by statute cannot spend more than 3% of what is generated. So that is a bit of a problem when you see the overall dollars coming down, because every year those numbers have been going down, and so they've had to do the same things with a whole lot less money than they were even 3-4 years years ago. That is set by statute, so that is a limitation. Let's see here. Okay, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. But this is how the grant cycle basically works on the excise tax. And it's basically a 90-day backlog, and as quickly as fuel prices are changing these days, even 90 days is a very difficult cycle to hedge your bets on as to what the next funding level will look like. And this is what happens on the sales tax as it's being returned. 65%, as I mentioned, goes to airports. 32% is actually maintained by the division for grants, and then 3% to run the operation itself. In addition to all of the program funds that we have put into place, especially on the grants, we have a lot of other programs that we've been able to do over the last couple of years, and some of them are actually cutting edge and maybe even hopefully not bleeding edge, but they are part and parcel of what we've been doing with NextGen. So we've issued about $20 million in grants last year for improvements. We cycle basically in the same eligibility items as the AIP program, but one of the biggest pieces that we've been able to do is to also support, once the FAA went back from 5% to a 10% match, the state of Colorado has been able to continue the 5% match that the airports have to come up with, and the state then provides the other 5%. And we have some small communities like Pueblo and others that simply cannot afford to do some of these projects with a 10% match. They have a very difficult time coming up with those funds, and I suspect California has very similar problems. And I think there's a number of airports that over the last few years have expressed how difficult it is to come up with a match just to do basic safety programs. So that is the way we actually leverage. We spent about $3.7 million, and we're able to leverage a little under, I think, $47 million worth of AIP projects doing that. And some of those projects would not have happened if we had not come up with that 5% differential. But let me talk a little bit about some of the other programs that we did in 2015 that with the funds that we had, we were able to do. We spent about $255,000 on a wildlife management program where we assisted the airports with their wildlife management. It has reduced incursions, bird strikes, etc. It's been a really successful program. We have dedicated fish and wildlife people, I believe it is, that handle the wildlife mitigation, both at Centennial Airport, all of the other airports, and it was just an absolutely fabulous program. They also assisted us with drafting those wildlife mitigation plans that all of us have in place now. We have a crack seal program, which is kind of interesting. We even bought some equipment, so an airport can just borrow it and have their own staff do the crack sealing. So we're actually getting more life out of some of our pavements because of that. So there's no moisture seeping in underneath and affecting the subbase. We have a communications and pilots program, about $500,000. Colorado is actually covered by, I think, 5 different sectionals. So we actually publish a separate map that is not to be used for aeronautical purposes, but it gives you a little bit of a perspective where all the airports are, where all the MOAs are, the military operating areas, where some of the restrictions are. It also helps us with our mountain flying programs, which can be very challenging when you have over 50 14ers in the state of Colorado. You don't want to just go and fly into the Rocky Mountains if you're not used to that. So, and then we also publish a directory of all of the airports. It's basically a single page with a photo of the airport and all of the essential information that you would like to see. Our 5010 inspections are paid out of this program. So we allocate about $20,000, which is not a lot of money, but it's enough to update the 5010s on a regular basis. Another program that we implemented a number of years ago, which has really been very, very successful, is our mountain AWAS system, where we have put surveillance cameras as well as automated weather observation stations up in the mountains. When you go up in the mountains in Colorado, you go into Aspen, you cannot get good radar data because the mountains basically block a lot of the signals that are coming, say, from Denver International Airport or otherwise. So this is supplemental information. We currently have 14 different stations. There's a picture on the upper right-hand side, the Mountain AWAS program. It's been highly successful and has been responsible for a drop in accidents that we've seen in the mountains as a result of weather that just kind of rolls in. We recently, today, rolled out a new video on the airport sustainability program. It's done in partnership with the FAA. Centennial Airport actually was one of the 3 pilot airports. We have what's called a WINS program, which is an automated program that you can just literally plug in all of the things that you might be working on a sustainability program, whether it's a social responsibility or simply long-term sustainability or even environmental responsibility. All of these things you can program in, and it spits out your sustainability program, including all of your dashboards for basically measuring how well you're doing if you're interested in those programs. It's been a super program for us. We're very excited to have that in place. And sometimes when you start to think about sustainability, it's very difficult to, you start out with, well, this is kind of an environmental thing, and then you realize, well, I can do all I want about the environment, but if my airport doesn't exist tomorrow, I have no sustainable program for the airport itself. So whether it's noise, whether it's the environment, all of those things come into play. One of the most interesting things that we have been involved in is the virtual tower program. Fort Collins Loveland Airport was just recently selected by the FAA to become the first airport to be tested in the United States to have a virtual tower program. What we're doing is we're going to be using both visual and other equipment, radar images, so where the traffic into and out of Fort Collins Loveland Airport can be monitored remotely. And actually air traffic controllers at a different tower a long ways away from the airport will be able to direct the traffic going in and out of that airport, simply using video linkages and other things. And so we'll be starting up that pilot project here very soon, and we're pretty excited about the prospects of having that program in place. We've had our community outreach program, whether it's through educations. Metro State University has had a student orientation program. They have a very active indoor airport, if you will. If you ever come to Denver and you want to see the indoor airport, it's an amazing operation over at MSU. Come and take a look at that. Girls in Aviation has been a very successful program, really trying to get more women involved in aviation. It's something that we have supported for a very, very long time. We have an state infrastructure bank loan program that the airport division or the aeronautics division has put money into it. Airports can actually borrow, and it's just a fraction above the federal rate for borrowing. Right now it's about 2.5% to borrow, no more than 10 years, and you can there's $10 million, that you can borrow for any aeronautical program, whether it's building a hangar or doing infrastructure such as ramps or storm drainage, anything, again, aviation related that supports that you otherwise wouldn't, that's not eligible for FAA funding or AIP funding that you could then fund out of your own pocket, typically just through the revenues that the airport would be generating. And then finally, I just want to mention something about a project that's very near and dear to my program at Centennial Airport, and that is our internship program. The aeronautics program pays for half the salary for an intern to work at Centennial Airport for a whole year. We currently run 2 interns. We cycle them every 6 months. It's a 1-year program. We get to take a look at these interns for an entire year. And very often they leave us before the end of their internship because Denver International Airport typically picks them off. They actually do everything there is to do. They usually come in on their first 3-month cycle, work the graveyard shift. That's when we have the least amount of mayhem and activity, but enough to get their feet wet, and then they come in from the dark. They spend 3 months in our office working on budget, working on planning, working in the noise office. They get to work with administration on leases. They really literally get to do everything that we get to do in airport administration. Then they go back out on the field in operations for 3 months. And at that point, they're out there during the daytime, responding to alert 1s, 2s, and hopefully not 3s, but on occasion we have those as well. Fabulous experience for these kids. They get to work with the FBOs. They get to know all the tenants on the airport. We do about 320,000 operations a year, 900 based aircraft, about 200 of that is jet traffic. Very busy place, 4 full-time FBOs that run 24/7. We have a 24/7 tower. So it's a busy facility, and these kids just get an amazing education. And we rarely, if ever, have anyone that cannot find a position somewhere. The ones that rise to the top, we pick them off and first and offer them a full-time job. We actually had a kid who his internship ran out, and we did not want to lose him, so he was willing to work in the maintenance department, and he ended up plowing snow, and then in the summertime he plowed. This is a kid with a bachelor's degree, 2 tours of duty with the Marine Corps in Afghanistan, just an amazing kid, and we wanted to keep him on the staff. We were able to do that, and just recently offered him a full-time position in operations where he really wanted to be, but he just took the call and did what needed to be done in order to stay with the airport. So I'm sure Denver International Airport is going to show him big bucks here not before too long, and we'll lose him. But great program. Again, half that base salary is paid for through the aeronautics program. I can't think of a better use of getting our young next generation airport managers and operators into this field. So that ends my presentation. Well, maybe not, because I think this is what we did to. I think they painted the tower just before I left. So I know Stephen asked who the Broncos fans were. So let me hear that one more time. Go Broncos! Thank you, John.
I get a picture of the tower, but it's in black and white. Okay, we're going to open it up for questions here. I'm going to take the prerogative to ask a couple of Robert before we get too far afield. And a couple of issues, Robert. First of all, you mentioned some numbers. I think I got the numbers right. 65% of the disbursement goes to 2 airports. Now, does that go through the aeronautics division, or does that go straight to the airport?
That goes first to the aeronautics division, and then they through the treasury, and then they disperse that back to the airports.
And then there's a list of eligible things that they can do with that?
Correct.
And then the division actually uses the other 32%, right?
And that's for grants,
for grants.
That basically mirror the AIP program, correct.
So how does the division relate to the aeronautics board? Who approves the projects?
Actually, the aeronautics board approves the projects, but we have a very competent staff who filter those projects.
Okay, very good. And then the board is appointed by the governor.
Yes, sir.
So the board reports to the governor. It doesn't report to somebody else.
We're actually division under the Department of Transportation. So
okay.
The director for the division reports to the director of transportation.
Okay.
Who reports to the governor.
All right.
And sits on the cabinet. So.
Okay. I was just trying to relate it to what we've got in our state, or our states, plural. The only one being significantly different is Hawaii. Rod mentioned a number of 70 to 200 million. Nobody knows right now, but the history of that is when we started these discussions, actually California Airports Council went to the Board of Equalization to get an estimate. think the first estimate was something like 30 million, wasn't, Sarah? And those of us collectively involved said, we don't think so. You might want to go back and look at that again and sharpen your pencil. So they did, and they came back with 100 million. And we said, we don't think so. You might want to go back and sharpen your pencil. So it's up to 140 million is the most recent number. And there are those of us who think at the end of the day it might be as much as 200 million. So that's the kind of numbers we're talking about. That the California response to the FAA that Robin mentioned pulled a number out of a hat of 25 million. So on the one hand, we've got a letter from the Department of Finance that says we're collecting 25 million, and we've got a memo from the Board of Equalization that says 140 million. So that's from two state agencies. So you can see how confused it is. So with those editorial comments, I'll open it up to questions. Carl.
On Saturday when we discussed this, somebody suggested we send a letter to the county. What's the purpose of that? Putting them on notice that we want. Did I mishear on Saturday when this was brought up?
I remember that coming up, and I can't remember who suggested it. But I believe there's already correspondence to the cities and counties, as you see from the responses that the FAA has already gotten. Somebody's getting the word.
Yeah, Monterey County has submitted a plan. I don't think they've shared that with us. It wouldn't, because we're our own separate entity, we're not like part of the county.
Right.
I would suspect if they follow suit, they would want to keep all the money for themselves, maybe to pay for the their aviation programs that they might have, or they could divert it to. Do we have a right to say, since money was generated on our airfield, we want a portion of that at least?
Ultimately, it's going to be up to the FAA.
Well, I think it, and we're going to write
Robin?
ourselves a big check. No. The plan has to say what the county, in your case, whether they have to be saying, we feel like everything was in place before 1987, and therefore we're grandfathered and don't have to make any changes. Or here's how much was before 87, and since then we've put in these extra taxes, and here's how we're going to, disperse them. They could say they're going to, it has to be for aviation, so I guess their choices would be give it to the local airport, which all of you would hope for, or run it back through the state. But they can't say we are collecting an extra 2% since 1987, and we've decided we're giving it to the school district, and that's what we're doing. That they would then get an answer from the FAA saying that's not a good plan. So try again. A plan that has aviation in it. So, but again, I think you got these plans, and some people are like the state plan says they're providing those services to the airports, and then they give a whole list of things that they're saying they're providing that some of us in the business were like, really? Wow. I didn't know that. So I think that's where the follow-up's going to come from, is getting
I guess my point is, though, if we disagree, do we have any right to protest that, and what would be the mechanism? Because they, like, the counties have to do an airport land use commission under state law. I would suspect that they're going to divert the money, because they've always complained that that's sort of an unfunded mandate from the state, that they may divert the money to do that. But it really has nothing to do with airfield operations.
Well, so this would just be it's all going to be available under Freedom of Information. So I think the first step for people would do is to ask them for a copy of the letter that they submitted, so you can see whether or not you agree with what they're saying or don't. So I would think that any of the ones that were listed up there, you can ask your local, whoever submitted the letter, for a copy of it. If you can't get it, it's going to all be available, FOIable through the FAA. So the letters are available local municipality response was. Get a copy of the letter and see what they said.
Okay.
Okay, other questions? I'm sorry, I'm looking directly into two spotlights. I can see silhouettes out there. Joe.
Robert, back to the disbursement thing. I'm just interested. How are those disbursement amounts determined? Is that by virtue of how much that airport has contributed with regard to those taxes generating those revenues?
Yeah, of the first 65% goes back as generated based on what the airport produced in both sales and excise tax. So it differs for every airport from a couple of $1,000s all the way to millions. Much of the money that frankly is generated for the state of Colorado, about 80-85%, comes from Denver International Airport. So they get a good chunk back, but they also generate a lot of funds that go back. Now the balance of that, 35%, 32% of that then goes into the grant program, and everybody applies for grants, and basically working with the FAA, the state planners work with the FAA planners and say, okay, what's the best project out there that has the highest priority? Safety coming first, obviously. So that's where the other 32% goes.
Great program. The 65%, that's a really novel approach. I would hope that the state of Arizona has a similar plan. And to Robin, has the FAA notified all of the cities where there is there is a tax that has been assessed, sales tax, for example? And what's interesting about our jurisdiction, we're a city of Phoenix owned and operated airport that wholly resides within the city, another city. And so there is a sales tax that they actually collect on those transactions within their jurisdictions, but it's going to be a little bit complex puzzling through that.
Well, so FAA didn't try and figure out who was collecting, so they just tried to reach out to everybody. And in some cases through the association.
As an example, Joe, in California, these letters were crossing, but in November the FAA sent, first of all, a letter to Governor Brown reminding him of the deadline, and then to cover the cities and the counties, they sent a letter to CSAC and a letter to the League of Cities, so that they would disperse it to their members. And I assume something similar to the other states. Other questions? All right, seeing no other questions, first of all, I want to thank the panelists, and we do have a certificate for Robert for a donation from the SWAI to the Wounded Warriors Project, and I believe Robin and Rod have already received one or more of those in this conference. And then I again want to thank our sponsors, HMMH, Mentor Field, and Yuma International Airport. And thank you, panelists.
I was going to drop the mic like Rod did and get everybody's attention. So right now we actually get a little bit of extra time. You probably need it after the lunch that you had today. So we're going to do the break with the exhibitors. We'll get started in there probably with right around 3:15 or so. So if you didn't put your business cards in, put them in over here. And if for those who were looking at going on that Monterey tour, make sure Chris and Mark are back over here. But Chris is the one coordinating. Right? So if you didn't sign up, please make sure you let her know, because she restricts it to that number that signed up or pre-registered. So make sure you guys talk to her about that. And with that said, we're going to let you guys get going, get up and stretch, and then make your way into the exhibitor hall. Yes, there will be a light snack provided. It looks like cookies.